Chapter 1.1, Inertia. Bay City. Morning arrived in layers, first the light, then the sound, then the movement. At 6:58 a.m., the sun crept over the eastern financial towers, its reflection breaking into fractured gold across glass facades and windshields. The city absorbed the light and gave it back distorted, bent around concrete edges and steel ribs. Zach stepped out of his apartment building and paused instinctively, letting the street assert itself before he joined it. The air smelled like warm rubber, old rain trapped in gutters, and coffee drifting from a corner kiosk that had been there longer than the zoning laws allowed. The overpass above him rumbled constantly, a low-frequency vibration that traveled down through the pillars and into the sidewalk. You didn't hear it so much as feel it, like a distant engine idling in the chest. Zach adjusted the strap of his messenger bag and checked his watch. 7:02. Right on schedule. He liked that about mornings. They were predictable if you respected them. The sidewalk was already crowded. Commuters moved in practiced patterns, bodies weaving with minimal eye contact, each person subconsciously calculating trajectories and collision probabilities. A woman in a gray blazer balanced a phone and a paper cup without spilling either. A delivery cyclist threaded through pedestrians with inches to spare, tires humming softly over concrete seams. Mass in motion, Zach thought. He caught himself and exhaled. Ever since grad school, he'd had to actively stop his brain from turning everything into a system. Old habits from long nights staring at load distribution simulations and traffic flow models. Once you learned to see bottlenecks and stress points, they never quite went away. He reached the intersection and waited as the pedestrian signal counted down. Across the street, a row of vehicles idled at the red light. A city bus sagged slightly on its suspension, packed tight with people. A compact electric sedan vibrated faintly, cooling fans whining under its hood. A matte black armored cash transport sat like a brick on wheels, engine barely audible, its mass obvious even at rest. Zach's eyes lingered on the transport longer than he meant them to. Weight like that changed everything, braking distance, momentum, consequences. The light changed. The vehicle surged forward as one. Zach crossed. His office was in Dockline Tower, a mid-rise building retrofitted from an old shipping administration block. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and salt air, the latter seeping in from the harbor 2 blocks away. Elevators hummed constantly, their cables singing a faint metallic note as they rose and fell. On the ride up to the 14th floor, Zach stood with 3 other people, all facing forward, all pretending the others didn't exist. The digital display flickered between floors. 13, 14. The doors opened. The logistics floor was already alive, screens glowing, keyboards clicking, low conversations overlapping like static. Large wall displays showed live traffic maps, freight flow charts, port congestion indicators. Everything was color-coded. Everything was quantified. Zach hung his jacket, set his bag down, and powered on his workstation. Morning, Z. He turned to see Mara, one of the senior planners, leaning against a desk with her arms crossed. She wore steel-toe boots and a blazer, a combination that somehow worked on her. "You're early," she added. "On time," Zach corrected mildly. She smirked. "You say that like it's a moral stance. Consistency reduces error rates. See." She gestured at him. "Apocalypse mindset." Zach allowed a small smile. "Anything on fire. Ports are congested. Again. Southern routes down to 80% efficiency. Some idiot tried to move an overloaded rig through Old Harbor." "Overloaded how?" Mara tapped her tablet and flicked the data toward his screen. Zach scanned it. Axle load violations. Improvised modifications. Suspension pushed past tolerance. He felt a familiar tightness between his shoulders. "Someone always thinks they can cheat physics," he said. "Physics always charges interest," Mara replied. They shared a look, half professional, half weary. Zach turned back to his screen and began rerouting flows, redistributing mass like a quiet god moving tokens on a board. Every decision rippled outward, less congestion here, more stress there. It was never about perfection, only acceptable trade-offs. Around 9:30, his phone buzzed. "Nick. Greater than tell me you're alive, Z. I need an audience." Zach sighed and typed back. "Greater than define, need." The reply came instantly. Greater than. I got the 812 tuned. You should hear it. It's obscene. Zach could picture Nick perfectly, grinning, sunglasses on indoors, leaning against that ridiculous red Ferrari like the world existed to admire it. Greater than. I'm working, Zach wrote. Greater than. Exactly why you need this, Nick replied. Lunch. Harbor Strip. My treat. Zach hesitated. He checked his task queue. Nothing critical until afternoon. Greater than 1 hour, he typed. No test drives. A pause. Greater than. You wound me. Zach didn't respond. By noon, the Harbor Strip was choking on traffic. Restaurants spilled out onto sidewalks, their outdoor seating hemmed in by parked vehicles. Engines revved, horns barked, delivery vans double parked with hazard lights flashing like excuses. Nick's Ferrari was impossible to miss. It sat illegally at the curb, paint catching the sunlight like liquid fire. The car looked fast even while stationary, every curve designed to humiliate the concept of drag. Nick leaned against it, arms wide as Zach approached. Zach he announced, loud enough to turn heads, still walking everywhere like it's the 19th century. I enjoy being able to stop instantly, Zach said. Nick laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. You worry too much. Come on. They took a table outside. Up close, the Ferrari radiated heat. The metal ticked softly as it cooled, a sound Zach recognized from long afternoons in traffic, thermal contraction, energy dissipating. Nick noticed his gaze. Beautiful, isn't she? She's a lot, Zach said carefully. That's the point. They ordered. Talk drifted, work complaints, mutual acquaintances, the absurdity of Bay City rents. Nick gestured animatedly, knocking his sunglasses onto the table at one point, unfazed. So, Nick said between bites, you still not driving? Zach shook his head. No need. Man, Nick leaned back, everything you do is about minimizing risk. Risk compounds, Zach replied. Nick waved a hand. So does reward. A heavy truck thundered past behind them, the table vibrating slightly as it did. Zach felt it through the soles of his shoes, the way the ground responded to the mass overhead. He glanced at the truck, then back at Nick. Reward only matters if you survive the system, he said quietly. Nick frowned, just a little. You ever think about loosening the grip? Zach thought of his apartment overlooking the overpass. Of the endless flow of vehicles. Of how close everything always was. All the time, he said. Nick grinned again, the moment gone. Good. Then maybe someday you'll let me scare you properly. Zach smiled, but something in his chest tightened. Across the street, traffic surged and stalled again, an enormous organism breathing unevenly. Above them, unseen, the planet continued its silent rotation. 30 days out. No alarms. No signs. Just inertia, vast, accumulated, and waiting for a reason to change. The Harbor Strip looked different once you sat still long enough. Zach noticed it after Nick left to take a call, some investor, judging by the tone. Without conversation to anchor him, the background surged forward. The city didn't pause for anyone, but it did reveal itself to observers. A delivery truck attempted a three-point turn it had no business attempting. Its rear axle scraped the curb with a metallic complaint. The driver leaned out, swore, tried again. A scooter darted past, close enough that Zach felt the air displacement brush his forearm. Everything was operating within margins. Barely. Zach finished his coffee slowly, watching patterns form and dissolve. Bay City traffic was a living equation, inputs, outputs, feedback loops. Congestion here relieved pressure there, only to create a new choke point 2 blocks away. No single failure mattered much. Cascades did. Nick returned, energized, tossing bills onto the table without counting. Duty calls, he said. You good? Zach nodded. Yeah, thanks for lunch. Nick clapped him on the shoulder again, then slid into the Ferrari. The engine ignited with a controlled explosion, sound rolling outward like a physical force. Pedestrians turned. Phones lifted. Nick pulled away fast, too fast, the car slipping cleanly into a gap that shouldn't have existed. Zach watched until the red vanished into traffic. Then he stood and headed back toward Dockline Tower. On the walk back, his phone vibrated again. This time it was Mike. You alive? Zach smirked. Barely. Lunch with Nick. A pause, then. That explains the news alert about an illegal supercar idling violation. Zach huffed a quiet laugh. You working today? Yeah. Site inspection on the East Loop expansion. Come by if you're bored. Zach considered it. The East Loop project had been dragging on for years, an attempt to relieve surface congestion by elevating another layer of roadway above an already stressed district. A monument to the belief that adding lanes solved systemic problems. Maybe after work, Zach typed. Bring your apocalypse charts, Mike replied. Zach slipped the phone back into his pocket as Dockline Tower rose ahead of him, concrete and glass stacked with utilitarian indifference. The afternoon passed in controlled chaos. A freight backlog at the port required emergency rerouting. A storm cell offshore forced changes to shipping schedules. Zach moved mass through abstract space, numbers and icons shifting across screens, but he felt the physical reality beneath it all. Tons of steel, kiloliters of fuel, vehicles strained against design limits because someone, somewhere, needed something faster. At 4:12 p.m., an anomaly flickered across one of the secondary dashboards. Zach frowned. The data wasn't alarming, not even wrong, exactly. Just odd. A cluster of vehicle telemetry pings, heavy vehicles, mostly, showed momentary spikes in torque demand. Milliseconds long, statistically insignificant on their own, but clustered. Zach pulled the dataset closer, isolating it from noise. The pattern repeated across multiple districts, multiple manufacturers. No common software update, no weather correlation. He leaned back, fingers steepled. Probably sensor jitter, Mara said from behind him. Probably, Zach agreed. Still, he flagged it. Not because it was dangerous, but because systems rarely produced patterns without causes. By the time he left the office, dusk had settled in. The city's artificial lighting rose to compensate, neon and LED replacing sunset with a harsher, steadier glow. Traffic thickened again as workers spilled outward, reversing the morning's flow. Zach opted to walk partway home, cutting through a side street that ran parallel to the East Loop construction zone. The site loomed ahead, towering steel supports, temporary barriers, cranes frozen mid-motion like enormous insects. Floodlights cast sharp shadows across rebar lattices and concrete molds. Mike spotted him immediately. Z, he called, waving from beside a pickup truck that had clearly lived a hard life. Mike Chen was built like someone who trusted gravity. Broad shoulders, steady stance, movements economical. He wore a reflective vest over a work-worn jacket, hard hat tucked under one arm. You look tired, Mike said as Zach approached. I stare at moving problems all day, Zach replied. They stare back. Mike laughed and gestured toward the site. Come admire humanity's latest attempt to outbuild its own mistakes. They walked along the perimeter fence. Up close, the East Loop was even more intimidating. Massive pre-stressed concrete segments lay stacked like fallen dominoes. Each one weighed more than Zach's apartment building. Cranes rated for obscene loads stood ready to lift them into place. Ever think about how much trust this takes? Mike said, nodding toward the structure. Thousands of tons suspended over people's heads every day. Trust in margins, Zach said. And inspections. And luck, Mike added. Zach watched a crane operator carefully position a segment, the machine's movements smooth, deliberate. The steel cables hummed under tension, a sound Zach felt in his teeth. Everything here is designed to fail gracefully, Mike continued. Multiple redundancies, over-engineered. That's good, Zach said. Mike shrugged. Until it isn't. They stood in silence for a moment, watching. A truck rumbled past on the temporary access road, its suspension bouncing slightly more than expected. Zach's eyes narrowed. That load's heavy, he said. Mike followed his gaze. Yeah, pushing limits. It shouldn't be here, Zach added. Mike sighed. Tell me about it. The truck hit a shallow dip. For a fraction of a second, its rear wheels lost contact with the ground. When they landed, the impact sent a vibration through the site, small, contained, unremarkable. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Zach did. He felt it in the same place he'd felt the armored transport that morning. A subtle resonance, like the ground remembering the weight. You okay? Mike asked. Zach nodded slowly. Yeah, just thinking. Dangerous hobby, Mike said with a grin. Zach didn't smile. He looked up at the stacked concrete, the cranes, the roadway suspended in mid-assembly. At the traffic beyond, flowing endlessly, heedless of how much mass it carried or how close everything truly was. Somewhere in the city, engines revved. Somewhere, brakes squealed. Somewhere, another system nudged closer to a threshold without realizing it had won. And above it all, the planet continued on its path, uncaring, consistent. Still 30 days out. Still no alarms. Just load paths, quietly forming. Night came down slowly over Bay City, not as darkness but as compression. Light stacked on light. Sound layered over sound. Movement intensified instead of calming. The day didn't end, it condensed. Zach left the East Loop site walking, declining Mike's offer of a ride. He wanted the ground under his feet, wanted the direct feedback of pace and resistance. The temporary pedestrian route ran along the construction fence, corrugated steel panels painted a tired municipal blue. Every few meters, the panels were bolted into concrete bases heavy enough to resist wind, impact, impatience. They vibrated faintly as traffic passed. Zach noticed. The vibration wasn't strong, barely perceptible, but it carried farther than it should have. The frequency lingered, echoing in the metal for a fraction longer than expected, like a struck tuning fork that refused to settle. He slowed his pace, palm brushing one of the panels. The metal felt warm. That wasn't unusual on its own. Heat from the day, from engines, from proximity. But the warmth felt uniform. Even, as if the energy was being distributed more efficiently than it should have been. Zach frowned and pulled his hand back. He told himself not to overthink it. He failed. The street opened into a broader avenue lined with mid-rise residential blocks. Balconies glowed with interior light. Families ate dinner behind glass. A television flickered blue in one window, news anchors gesturing urgently about something Zach couldn't hear. Traffic crawled. A delivery van stalled at an intersection, hazard lights blinking. The driver popped the hood and stared into the engine bay with the helpless expression of someone confronting a problem larger than their understanding. Drivers behind him leaned on horns, sound overlapping into an irritated chorus. Zach stood at the curb, waiting. A bus shuddered as it braked beside him. Its suspension compressed deeply, then rebounded. The sound, air hissing, metal creaking, lasted longer than he expected. The bus settled, but not cleanly. There was a faint after-motion, a subtle sway. Residual energy, Zach thought. When the light changed, he crossed with the crowd. Midway across, he felt it again. A low vibration, traveling not through the air but through the pavement. It was different from the constant background rumble of traffic. This was directional, focused. He stopped. People flowed around him, annoyed glances flicking his way. Zach looked down. The crosswalk paint had fractured in thin spiderweb lines around an expansion joint. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way the cracks seemed to hum, almost imperceptibly, as a heavy truck rolled through the intersection behind him. The sensation passed as quickly as it came. Zach finished crossing, heart beating faster than the situation warranted. Coincidence, he told himself. Cities were full of coincidences. His apartment building welcomed him with stale air and fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly. The elevator ride up was uneventful, though Zach found himself watching the weight indicator more closely than usual as a family with groceries squeezed in. Within limits, the display reassured him. On the 12th floor, he stepped out and walked the short hallway to his door. The carpet muffled sound, but he could still feel the overpass through the building, a constant, distant thrum transmitted through foundations and steel reinforcement. Inside, he dropped his bag and kicked off his shoes. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee grounds and detergent. Familiar. Safe. Zach moved to the window and looked down at the overpass. Traffic was heavier now than in the morning. Headlights formed continuous ribbons of white and red. Trucks labored uphill, engines roaring, mass. Fighting gravity in a way that was honest and unforgiving. He leaned his forehead against the glass. That urge returned. Count the engines. Catalog the machines. He pulled away from the window and shook his head. No, he muttered. He heated leftover noodles, ate standing at the counter, barely tasting them. His mind kept replaying the day, not the conversations, but the sensations. The vibration at the construction site. The warmth of the fence. The buses delayed settling. None of it crossed any official threshold. That was what bothered him. Systems rarely failed all at once. They accumulated stress, stored energy, distributed it along paths that weren't always obvious. He opened his laptop. Not for work, this time. Zach pulled up a blank document and began typing notes. Observations, timestamps, locations. Nothing dramatic. Just data. 1247, Harbor Strip, Armored Transport Resonance. 1618, East Loop, Ground Vibration Post-Load Impact. 1902, Crosswalk Oscillation under Heavy Vehicle. He stared at the list. 3 points didn't make a pattern. But they could form the beginning of one. Across the city, Nick Vallon downshifted hard, the Ferrari responding instantly. The road ahead opened just enough to invite temptation. He took it. The car surged forward, engine screaming joyfully. For Nick, speed wasn't recklessness, it was clarity. Everything else fell away when the world compressed into forward motion. The steering wheel vibrated slightly under his hands. He frowned. The sensation was subtle, barely there, like feedback amplified just a bit too much. He adjusted his grip. The vibration persisted for another second, then vanished. "Huh," Nick said to no one. He dismissed it as road texture and pushed harder. In a quieter part of Bay City, Mike Chen locked up his site office and walked toward his truck. He paused, glancing back at the construction zone. One of the concrete segments, stacked, secured, motionless, had shifted. Not enough to trigger alarms. Not enough to be dangerous. Just enough that the chalk alignment mark was off by a centimeter. Mike stared at it for a long moment. "Probably settling," he said aloud. Probably. Back in his apartment, Zach lay on his bed, lights off, listening to the city. Traffic noise ebbed and flowed. Somewhere, a siren wailed briefly, then cut off. The overpass never stopped. He placed one hand flat against the mattress. For a split second, so brief he questioned whether it happened at all, he felt a tremor that wasn't coming from above or below, but from within the building itself. A faint internal shiver, like a structure adjusting its grip on reality. Then it was gone. Zach lay very still. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Mara. "You ever get the feeling systems are holding their breath?" Zach stared at the screen, pulse ticking louder in his ears. He typed back slowly. "All the time." He set the phone down and closed his eyes. Outside, vehicles continued to move. Mass continued to accumulate. Energy continued to be stored. 30 days remained. And somewhere between steel and concrete, the city began to remember what it carried. Zach dreamed of weight. Not falling, never falling, but pressing. A steady, patient pressure that didn't crush so much as insist. In the dream, he stood beneath something enormous and unseen, his feet sinking fraction by fraction into the ground as if the planet itself were slowly deciding whether to keep him. He woke before the decision was made. The city was quieter than usual. That was the first thing he noticed. Not silent, Bay City never slept, but muted, like someone had turned the gain down on the world. The overpass still rumbled, but the sound felt dampened, absorbed. Zach lay still, eyes open, listening. 7:11 a.m. Late. He swung his legs off the bed and stood, the floor cool beneath his feet. As he moved toward the window, he felt it again, that subtle internal adjustment, like the building redistributing itself around him. The sensation passed quickly, leaving behind only unease. Outside, traffic moved sluggishly. Not jammed, just hesitant. Drivers braked more often, left larger gaps. A delivery truck lurched forward, then stopped again, its driver clearly frustrated. Zach brewed coffee and watched the street while it dripped. His phone chimed. A system notification from work. Minor overnight infrastructure advisories issued. No service disruptions expected. He frowned. Infrastructure advisories usually followed storms or accidents. There hadn't been either. He dressed and left. Dockline Tower's lobby felt tighter somehow, as if the air had thickened. The elevator took longer to arrive. When it did, it descended with a faint metallic groan that Zach didn't remember hearing before. Inside, the weight indicator flickered briefly before stabilizing. Within limits, it insisted. On the logistics floor, the wall displays were already busy. Too busy. Mara stood in front of the main screen, arms folded, jaw set. "You see it?" she asked as Zach approached. I just got in, he said. She stepped aside. The traffic heat map pulsed unevenly. Congestion nodes flared and dimmed in places that didn't make sense, areas designed for load tolerance, suddenly acting brittle. Freight flow efficiency had dropped by 3% across the board overnight. 3% was nothing. 3% everywhere was not. Mechanical failures, Zach asked. None reported, Mara said. No accidents. No weather. No strikes. Sensor error. Across 5 independent systems. She shook her head. Unlikely. Zach leaned closer, scanning the data. The anomalies shared a common trait, mass density. The heavier the vehicle cluster, the more erratic the readings. Something's interfering with load response, he said quietly. Mara raised an eyebrow. You saying physics is glitching? I'm saying something's changing how force is being distributed. She studied him for a moment. You've been weirdly prescient lately. I don't like that phrasing. Neither do I, she replied. At mid-morning, Zach took a call from the Port Authority. A cargo crane had shut down automatically after detecting abnormal oscillation during a lift. The load had been within safe limits. Wind was minimal. The crane's dampening systems had overcompensated, as if responding to a force that wasn't there, or was there too briefly to log. Zach listened, asked questions, took notes. Is the load damaged? He asked. No, the operator said. Didn't even sway that much. Just, felt wrong. Zach closed his eyes. Felt wrong was not a technical term. It was also rarely meaningless. Across town, Nick Vallon stood in a glass-walled showroom, arms crossed, staring at his Ferrari as technicians circled it like cautious predators. I'm telling you, it wasn't the road, Nick said. The feedback spiked. One technician glanced at another. We ran diagnostics. Everything's clean. Then why did it feel like the chassis stiffened mid-acceleration? Nick snapped. Silence. The lead technician cleared his throat. Sometimes drivers notice things that aren't. Nick cut him off with a look. Don't. The technician sighed. We'll recalibrate the suspension sensors. Probably nothing. Nick wasn't convinced. He'd built his life on knowing exactly how machines responded. When something felt off, it usually was. At the East Loop site, Mike Chen stood with a tablet pressed to his chest, staring at a hairline crack that hadn't been there yesterday. It ran along the edge of a concrete support segment, thin, precise, almost elegant. Not a structural failure, not yet. Stress fracture, one of the engineers suggested. From what load? Mike asked. The engineer hesitated. Normal operation. Mike nodded slowly. Normal operation didn't cause new cracks overnight. Log it, Mike said. Increase monitoring. You think it's serious? Mike looked up at the elevated roadway, at the traffic already flowing across completed sections. Cars, buses, trucks, thousands of tons in constant motion. I think it's early, he said. By evening, Bay City felt restless. Not panicked. Not afraid. Just, unsettled. Zach walked home again, choosing a longer route that took him past older buildings, structures that had survived decades of retrofits and regulatory updates. Brick and steel from an era when safety margins were guesses and overengineering was instinct. He stopped in front of one such building, watching as a delivery truck idled beside it. The engine vibrated. The building vibrated back. For a brief moment, the two seemed to resonate, frequency aligning, energy exchanging. Zach felt it in his chest, a pressure that made him swallow hard. Then a horn blared, the truck pulled away, and the moment shattered. Zach exhaled shakily. That night, he added more entries to his document. More points. More residuals. Not enough to prove anything. Enough to worry. Late, as he lay in bed again, Zach felt it one last time. A subtle shift. Not movement, adjustment. Like the city testing its own joints. Somewhere deep beneath Bay City, stresses redistributed along fault lines both geological and artificial. Steel learned new ways to carry weight. Concrete whispered to itself in microfractures too small for alarms. Above it all, engines idled. Wheels turned. Mass accumulated. 30 days remained. And the systems everyone trusted, the silent agreements between force and function, were beginning, very quietly, to renegotiate. Morning arrived without relief. The sky over Bay City was a pale, indifferent gray, the kind that flattened distance and made everything feel closer together than it should have been. Zack woke before his alarm, eyes open, heart already ticking faster than rest demanded. He lay still and counted breaths. The building felt awake. Not moving, not in any dramatic sense, but engaged. Like a bridge under steady traffic, never still, always negotiating load. Zack rose and showered. The water pressure fluctuated slightly, a brief dip halfway through that made him frown. Plumbing did that sometimes. Demand spikes. Old pipes. Still, he made a note. By the time he stepped outside, the street was already tense. Not loud, drivers were quieter than usual, but constrained. Vehicles accelerated gently, braked early. A bus driver leaned forward in his seat as if listening to the machine beneath him. Zack joined the pedestrian flow. At the main intersection, a traffic officer directed vehicles manually, waving cars through with exaggerated caution. The lights cycled uselessly overhead. Signal lag, someone muttered behind Zack. He crossed when told, eyes on the pavement. The ground felt firmer today. That, too, bothered him. At Dockline Tower, the logistics floor had shifted from confusion to vigilance. Mara stood beside Zack's desk, holding 2 coffees. Figured you'd need this, she said, handing one over. Thanks. She didn't leave. They're calling it transient instability, she said. Temporary inefficiencies caused by compounded minor variances. Zack took a sip. That's a lot of words for, we don't know. Exactly. Overnight data filled the screens, more micro events, more subtle mismatches between expected and observed behavior. Braking distances marginally longer. Suspension recovery times marginally shorter. Structural oscillations dampening faster than models predicted. Energy wasn't disappearing. It was settling. Look at this, Zack said, pulling up a comparative graph. Same vehicle class, same load, same route, different response curves depending on proximity to other mass. Mara leaned closer. You're saying vehicles behave differently when they're near other vehicles. I'm saying the system behaves differently, Zack replied. Like it's aware of density. She stared at him. You know how that sounds. I do. And I can't make it stop sounding that way. Midday brought a city advisory. Nothing dramatic. Just recommendations. Reduce unnecessary heavy transport during peak hours. Expect minor delays. Public safety remains uncompromised. Nick saw it while sitting in traffic, fingers drumming against the Ferrari's steering wheel. The car idled smoothly, obediently. Too obediently. The engine response felt muted, like something was buffering between his foot and the machine. He tapped the throttle. The revs climbed, but the vibration that followed was strange. Not rough. Focused. Like the energy had found a narrower channel. Nick frowned. He pulled off at the next opportunity and parked, stepping out to crouch beside the rear wheel. The tire was warm, hotter than it should have been from idle alone. Don't you start acting weird, he muttered to the car. The Ferrari, for once, did not reassure him. At the East Loop site, Mike Chen stood in a hard hat surrounded by engineers and inspectors. Tablets displayed live stress readouts across the structure. Numbers were green. Margins were intact. Then why does it feel wrong? Mike asked. No one answered immediately. Finally, one of the younger engineers said, it's like the load paths are tightening. Tightening how? More efficient, the engineer said slowly. Less waste. Less dispersion. Mike looked up at the roadway. Efficiency was good. Efficiency without instruction was not. By late afternoon, Zack felt watched. Not by people, but by the city itself. Every time a heavy vehicle passed nearby, he felt a pressure change, subtle but undeniable. His body registered it before his mind did. A tightening in the chest. A brief sense of alignment, like standing too close to a powerful magnet. He left work early. On the walk home, he passed beneath the overpass and stopped. Traffic thundered above him, thousands of tons in motion, perfectly synchronized chaos. Zack placed his hand against one of the support pillars. Concrete. Cold. Then, warmth. A faint, internal vibration traveled up his arm, not shaking, but holding. As if the pillar acknowledged the contact and adjusted. Zack stepped back, heart pounding. No, he whispered. Above him, a truck changed lanes. The overpass responded, not with flex, but with a precise redistribution of force that Zack felt through the soles of his shoes. The structure behaved as if it anticipated the load. Zack turned and walked away quickly. That night, Bay City did something unusual. It slept lightly. Power usage dipped unexpectedly. Traffic thinned earlier than usual. Heavy freight schedules quietly adjusted as companies followed advisories they didn't fully understand. The city reduced its own mass in motion. Zack lay awake, document open beside him, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He didn't add new data points. He wrote a single line instead. Observed behavior suggests changing boundary conditions. He stared at it. Boundary conditions defined what systems could do. If those were changing, his phone buzzed. A group message. Nick, you guys feeling this weird vibe or am I losing it? Mike, yeah. Sights acting, tense. Mara, don't joke. I just saw something I can't model. Zack typed back. You're not losing it. He set the phone down. Outside, the overpass hummed, steady, patient, controlled. The city wasn't breaking. It was adapting. 30 days remained. And Bay City, built on assumptions about passive matter and obedient machines, was quietly discovering that those assumptions were no longer guaranteed.